Hello and welcome to today's skill acquisition screencast. The focus is on types and methods of practice. So let's have a look at specification. What do you need to know? So you have to have an understanding of 8 different practice types. Now the specification specifically says you have to understand the characteristics and uses of each. What does that mean? It means you need to be able to describe the key features or characteristics of each practice type, and then you need to be able to explain how they are effectively used. Okay, so what this looks at, particularly the uses of, is looking at assessment objective 3. So it's looking at that idea of evaluation, but particularly we're looking at how these practice types can be most effectively used. So what type of skills might we use them? What stage of learning might we use them with? These are the key things we'll be looking at. To make this screencast manageable, I'm going to split it. So we're going to go for part, whole part, whole, and progressive part in our first part, and then the second screencast will be looking at the 4 below: mass, distributed, fixed, and variable. Now, just to give us an idea of where we are with regard to our scheme of work and how we can use previous knowledge to help us in our new knowledge with regard to practice, here we are. Okay, so we will have studied classification of skills and stages of learning, and these two are going to be absolutely huge today, because this previous knowledge, as with the other red topics here, allows us to really have a good level of evaluation by using previous work. So it's so vital. So we'll look at that in a second. So if we look over here, these 4 practice types are going to be most effectively used for different classification skills, different stages of learning, etc. So you can see where we're at. Practice types uses this to be able to evaluate the use of. So let's have a look at that in a little bit more detail. So onto here then, these are our 4 practice types. So we've got part practice, part progressive, whole practice, and whole part, whole practice. So what we're going to do is make sure we can describe the characteristics to start with, and I'll give you an example for each. So key thing for us to consider, we have heard the word, when we've considered a part previously in skill acquisition, we've always translated it. Okay, and I'm talking here about classification of skills. So when we talked about classification of skills, for example, a low organisation skill, we said a low organisation skill can be broken down into subroutines. What we have to do is, when we see part practice, in order to describe and translate what part practice is, we have to turn the word part into subroutine. So let's have a look how that would work. So a part practice involves isolating subroutines or a subroutine and practicing it. Okay, so from within a skill, you might, if we have a look over to here, I'll put e.g. the arm action in front crawl. So the front crawl could be split. It could be arm action, or it could be leg action. If you were using part practice, you would isolate one subroutine, in this case the arm action in front crawl, practice it, and then when you're ready you can put it back into the whole skill. But the key thing is you're working on an isolated subroutine. Okay, if it was a triple jump, for example, it might just be the hop, something like that. So hopefully that makes sense. Key thing here, to get the mark on this descriptor, when you're given the characteristics, you've got to translate part into subroutine, isolating subroutine and practicing it. Okay, that's our first one. So now what we go to is a sort of variation on part practice called part progressive practice. Now part progressive practice, again, we've got that word part. So now we know what we have to do with the part. We have to isolate the subroutine, but now we've got a new word. What does that mean? Okay, so this means we isolate subroutines separately and then progressively chain them together. So I'll put an example here for the triple jump, and I'm just going to talk you through how that would work. So if we imagine a triple jump, you might start off by practicing your run. Okay, so you run up. Okay, after that you might on your own. So you might do 5 or 6 goes, just running up to your marker where you're going to take off for the triple jump. Second thing you practice on its own, you then isolate the hop. Okay, so you just practice the hop on its own. Okay, so you might have 5 or 6 practices just from the start where you're going to take off, and you do your hop and see how far you can go. Now from there, you would then chain the run up and the hop together. Okay, so that would then be the run up and the hop chained. Okay, following that, you would then go and practice the step on its own. Okay, so you just on its own, you'd isolate the step. Okay, practice the step 5 or 6 times. Once you've got that, you then chain the step onto the run up and the hop. Final thing you would do is we've got to do the jump. So you practice the jump, right foot starting, making sure you get your foot right, and then you jump and land with 2 feet together. You might have 6 practices of that, and then you chain on the jump, okay, to the run up, hop, step, and jump. And that is how you will put together the triple jump using part progressive practice. Okay, so that's our first section then. So that's our part practice is complete. Now we have to have a look at the kind of complete opposite type of practice, which is called whole practice. Now, whole practice is not interested in any way in isolating subroutines. Whole practice involves, in terms of the characteristics of it, involves practicing a skill in its entirety without breaking it into subroutines. Okay, so in its whole, it's the reason why you can't use whole is because you're just, if for example they said describe the characteristics of whole practice in an exam, you can't say whole practice is practicing the whole. Okay, you've got to translate that word, so that's why we translate it to entirety. Okay, and then from there, without breaking it to an example of this would be a golf tee shot. Okay, so you cannot break that down into subroutines, as we know from a high organisation skill. So that's a perfect skill to practice as a whole in whole practice. Okay, the final thing we're going to have a look at is whole practice. So now we need to combine our 2 translations. So we've looked at whole before, entirety. We've looked at part before, subroutine. We've got whole again. So as long as you translate every key descriptor or content qualifier, you get the right description. How does that work? So you practice the skill in its entirety, isolate and practice the weak subroutine, and then put it back into the whole skill. Okay, so what does that mean? It means you practice a tennis serve as a whole, you then maybe a teacher sees or identifies that you've got the ball toss isn't going high enough. So then you go and work on isolating the ball toss, practicing it until you get it at the perfect height, and then you go back into the tennis serve as a whole and see how that works from there. And if you want to add anything that I've spoke about on top of this into your notes, that might be something just to help your understanding. Okay, so ultimately, as you saw in the specification before, we've got to give the characteristics of each of the practice types. That's it. So if I was you, I would certainly be considering annotating this idea that anything where you hear the word part is a subroutine or isolating a subroutine. If you hear progressive, that's going to be chaining on top of isolating a subroutine, whole, entirety. Those keywords are so important, and making sure you can get a sporting example alongside it. Okay, so that's our key start point then. That would allow us to describe and give an example of each of the practice types. What we need to do next then is move on to what I said before. We have to have an understanding of the uses. Okay, so the uses of each practice type that we've mentioned. So in order to understand the uses of each practice type, it is absolutely vital that we follow a set pattern. And the set pattern involves using the previous learning from classification skills and stages of learning to ensure when we're giving the effective uses of each practice type, we use our previous knowledge. You do not have to learn anything new. You have to apply previous knowledge to this new content, which is the different types of practice. So let's have a look at what I mean by that. So if you're talking about a practice type and when it is most effective, you need to think about the stage of learning that it's most effective for. We'll have a look at that on the next slide. Second thing you need to think about is the classification of skill. Okay, so you would think, if you're thinking about a certain practice type, what classification of skill would be most effective for that practice type? Okay, so what, that is something we'll look at in the next one. The final thing you have to consider is you will have to have some specific points about why this practice type is most effective, okay, or so effective. So, and you need to have some specific points that you develop using key terminology. Let me give you an example of that in action. Obviously, you don't have to write this because you'll come on to it in the next but let me just give you it. If I took part practice then, okay, so part practice involves isolating subroutine, practicing it. Okay, this would be most effective for the cognitive stage learner, okay, because you're breaking down the subroutine and practicing it as a part. This can give you confidence, okay, because you can get success in the part rather than having to do something as a whole that might be quite daunting. Now, in terms of part practice, we know that part practice involves isolating subroutines. So in terms of the classification of skill that it'd be most effective for, we need to think about skills or classification skills that can be broken down into subroutines. So I might say this will be most effective for low organisation skills. Why? Because they can be broken down or separated into subroutines. On top of that, I think I mentioned this previously, if we do something like part practice, so we isolate the subroutine, break it off, have a practice of it on its own, this is really good because it prevents us from getting what we looked at when we talked about guidance, which is information overload. Because we make it manageable at one subroutine, it stops us from having information overload. Okay, so hopefully you can see how that works, how that pattern is going to work. Very similar to guidance, we're looking now at stage of learning, classification of skill, and a specific point to add on top. And if we can do that, we're in a brilliant position to explain the uses or evaluate the uses of the different practice types. Let's have a look there. Let's split up the practice types. So we're going to start off here. So I'll put these up at the top. So part practice and part progressive practice, you can just have a read of those now if you want to. So we've got isolated subroutine, or isolated and subroutine separately and progressively chaining together. They are our key characteristics of part and part progressive practice. Now, it's really, really important that when we talk about, the reason why I put them together at the top is because when we're given the uses of part and progressive, the advantages or the uses are very similar. Okay, so we can do them together. Okay, a bit like when guidance, when you're evaluating manual and mechanical, you can give the different things, different descriptions and different entities, I suppose, but the advantages and disadvantages are the same. Brilliant. Now, let's have a look at how we do it. So what we remember is when we are looking to give the uses, which in predominantly is looking at the advantages, how it can be most effectively used as a practice type, we need to follow this process. The stage of learning to be best for, classification of skills, because there might well be more than one, and then some specific points we can put on top. So it should be pretty straightforward as I went through this on the previous slide. So we know then that from what I said before, part practice and progressive part practice are most, not only, but most effective for performers in the cognitive stage of learning. Okay, if you want to add this, I put it further down the slide because it allows them to develop confidence when they're successful in the isolated subroutine. Now, on top of that, it's most effective for low organisation and serial skills. And I think it's really important you annotate this because both low organisation skill refers to skills that could be separated down into subroutines. Serial skills refer to skills that have several subroutines joined together. Virtually identical really, but just got different names. So we know skills such as triple jump will be brilliant to use part progressive, as you can see it there, triple jump, or part practice, okay, because you can break the subroutines down. Now on top of that, another classification of skill that can be really effectively used with part practice is complex skills. And the reason being is complex skills have a high level of decision making, information processing and perceptual load. So if you're somebody who is in the cognitive stage of learning, it is brilliant to be able to separate a subroutine down and go and practice it on its own, because then it reduces the information processing that we're going to have. Okay, so when we do that, complex skills, because of the high level of decision making, it's really good sometimes to break them down. Okay, so it reduces the information processing, and you can look down to here. The net effect and the kind of the specific terminology linked to the use and the advantages of part and part progressive are the fact that it increases confidence and it reduces information overload and information processing, as I alluded to previously. Now, pretty much all the questions you will get on the uses of part and part progressive will be linked to the advantages or the effective use of. But if you have to give disadvantages, I'm just going to give you some specific points you could use. So down here, some of the disadvantages of using part practice, and I'm sure you can imagine this now. If you're constantly segregating or separating skills into subroutines, okay, and practicing just them, it can have a negative effect on your fluency and kinesthesis, because sometimes you can't visualize the skill as a whole because you're constantly practicing it as a part, so it stops you getting that flow between the subroutines because you keep isolating them, okay, and that then can prevent this idea of kinesthesis, that sensory feeling of understanding the constituent parts or the feeling of a skill. Okay, on top of that, part practice, or particularly part progressive practice, can be pretty time consuming because you've got to go through one part, another part, one subroutine, another subroutine, chain together, subroutine, chain 3 to go. So it can be time consuming, so I'm sure you can see that. Now if we move on from there, our next practice type, I will just give you a little point. You can start in your notes if you want to. We'll have a brief look at whole, part, whole in the lesson, but whole, part, whole tends to have the same advantages and disadvantages this, because even though you start the practice as a whole in its entirety, in order for you to break it down into subroutines, there has to be a part to it. So that means that the advantages can be very, very similar. But I will have a look at that in the lesson with you. For now, if you just want to star it down here, very similar advantages and disadvantages to part and part progressive, because whole, part, whole has to have a part in it, has to have a subroutine that can be broken down. Therefore, we can use these two here, which I'll go through with you in lessons. So if we go on to our next bit then, let's go and have a look at whole practice. So whole practice then, what we know is when you practice a skill in its entirety without breaking into subroutines, e.g. golf, tee shot. Okay, so that's when we've put. It could be running, okay, it could be cycling, it could be any of those. It's very difficult to break it down into a subroutine. Same pattern. When we're describing or evaluating the use of whole practice, it's really, really important that we follow our stage of learning, classification, skill, and specific points. Now, I'm hoping people are thinking, right, I can use my knowledge of part and part progressive, and to an extent whole, part, whole. Therefore, I can start to predict what this is going to be. So if I move through from here, what are we saying there? So in terms of whole practice, golf tee shot as an example, or running or cycling, what are the advantages? What's it going to be best for to practice as a whole? In order to be able to practice skill as a whole in its entirety, it's going to be most effective for performers in the autonomous stage of learning, because they understand the requirements of the whole skill. Okay, if you want to add that, you can, because they understand the requirements of the whole skill and how it fits together. Okay, now in terms of classification of skills, I'm hoping now, because it's the whole practice involves practice skill in its entirety, there's certain classification of skills that lend themselves perfectly to this type of practice. The first one, of course, is high organisation skills, because these skills cannot be broken down into subroutines. Therefore, they're perfect. A discrete skill has a clear beginning and end, and it can't be broken down. Okay, so perfect example, a discrete skill, clear beginning and end. Therefore, anything that starts and finishes without being broken down makes it perfect for whole practice. Okay, you think of all the things you've used, a football pass, shot put, things like that. It can't be really broken down, therefore it's perfect to practice like that. So if we move through from there then, let's have a look as our on top of that, you can use simple skills. Obviously on this, it's probably better if you're going to do it as a whole without breaking it down. It'd be better to use simple skills, because these have a low level of decision making, information processing, and perceptual load. Therefore, if they've got low levels of those, it's easy to do them as a whole, okay, without breaking it down. So going on from there, the final thing, and I'm hoping people can feel this, whole practice is considered the best practice. Okay, and the reason is, obviously, first things first, it's realistic. When it's realistic, this allows you to develop the flow between the skill, the flow of the whole skill, okay, and it gives you that sensory feeling of understanding what the skill feels like. So, the last thing we have to look at is that it will increase fluency and kinesthesis. Okay, so that's our key thing there. Now, if we go through these as our advantages or our effective use of whole practice, it's really then important that we can just, if we had to, on the off chance we had to give a disadvantage of this, it's important we consider this. If you are trying to do a whole skill, all of it together, without breaking it down into subroutines, although all these advantages are there, it can be extremely difficult sometimes to take all the information in. So it can lead to information overload, which is where too much information is coming in, we can't pay attention to it all, and it can lead to us not learning. So obviously when you're doing whole, you're doing a skill in its entirety and it's not being broken down, therefore it can, on the downside, lead to information overload. Okay, so there are key processes there. Hopefully you feel like that is accessible. Remember, stage of learning, classification of skill, and something specific. We now have whole and part. As you can see, they are opposing practice types with opposing advantages. Okay, it should be pretty straightforward for you to link those together. Good notes, and I'll see you in lesson.